Welcome, everybody, to Theory Underground. What you're about to hear is a conversation that I had with Benjamin Burgis. Ben Burgis on an MStew, epic marathon stream at Theory Underground that happened on the 18th of September. We're finally getting it posted. This was one of my favorite conversations I've had with somebody who studies Marx. I found it very illuminating, and I really appreciate the sort of depth and rigor that Burgis was able to go into here. I've seen him do a lot of stuff online here and there, little bits and pieces, and it's often a more conversational sort of debate analysis kind of thing that he's doing. I wanted to take this opportunity to kind of put him up on a little pedestal and let his brain sort of shine, and I think it really does. So, folks, I don't care what your politics are. I don't care if you vote for Trump. I don't care if you vote for Harris. I don't care if you don't vote at all. I don't care if you're a Christian. I don't care if you're an atheist. At Theory Underground, we don't really care about any of that stuff. What we really care about is the depth and rigor and the sort of I think the kind of thinking that you'll see modeled here. I think this is what matters. And so, whether you are a leftist or not, whether you see him as the sort of the logic bro professor guy or what, I think you should just stop with that and just pay attention to this is Benjamin Burgis thinking and working through ideas, and these are especially important ones for doing the kinds of work that we're doing here at Theory Underground. And if you're interested in what we are doing at Theory Underground, stick around until the end of the video and watch the PSA that I made so that you can kind of get a sense for the vibe, so that you can kind of figure out ways to get involved if you want to. Yeah. With that, let's get to it. I hope that you will enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Welcome back, everybody, to Theory Underground. This is an epic marathon live stream happening on September 18th, 2024. And today we are joined by Benjamin Burgis himself. Welcome. How you doing, Ben?
I am good. I just noticed the cat like kind of in the corner of the background.
You can see him. Yeah. I don't think the people on stream can see him, but that's Thomas. He's a little guy. He's a new kitty. He's great. He's a great cat. Yeah. In fact, here, let me go ahead and just see if I can show people, folks on stream. Can you see that? No, people can't see it. Whatever. We've got something like 50 viewers right now. We've got a lot of people really excited that you're here. We were worried for a minute that you weren't going to be here. We're glad you are. It's great to have you. And what we wanted to talk to you about today is Karl Marx's theory of value. You just wrote a very interesting piece. I'm very interested in it, even though I have barely read it. But part of how this works for me is it kind of helps me to not have read it yet, because that way I can play the audience role, because the audience hasn't read it either, presumably. And so, the goal is that we get people interested in it enough that they go read it today or tomorrow. And so, first of all, where did you publish it?
So I published this on my Substack. It's called Philosophy for the People. So it's just myname.substack.com.
Cool. And so what was it that brought you to writing this paper? I imagine it didn't just come out of nowhere.
Sure. So I've been teaching a Zoom class on Capital. I'd actually done that before. I did a couple years ago. The Michael Albert was doing this thing, the School for Social and Cultural Change, and I started teaching it through there. Then when it went on hiatus, we just kind of continued on my Patreon, and then I don't know, like a year or something after that one ended, started a new one. And so, more than anything, it just kind of came out of that class. And then also, of course, there are people who are, taking those classes who, this is not their first rodeo. They've read Capital before, they have opinions about it, and so this just kind of emerged out of really the second time I was teaching the material, that there were places where I thought Marx was saying one thing, and there'd be, people who are like, no, 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 that can't be it, right? And I started thinking about it, and eventually got to the point where this seemed interested, especially because I just read a book by William Clare Roberts called Marx's Inferno: The Political Theory of Capital, and
Mm, mm-hmm.
I think it's in a lot of ways I like that book. I think there's a lot of good stuff in it, but on this particular issue, Roberts just sort of very confidently says, "Oh, Marx definitely doesn't think this." And I was like, well, I don't know. Kind of seems like he does.
And so, what is it that Roberts
Yeah,
is saying that Marx
yeah, yeah.
doesn't
So
think?
right. So Roberts just says very confidently that Roberts doesn't think that commodities have values in earlier modes of production. He gives the examples of, ancient Athens or Carolingian Europe. Uh, and it seems to me that there's actually quite a bit of textual evidence that at least by the time Marx writes Capital, he actually does think that. So it's possible that he didn't when he was writing some of the earlier like notebooks that were later posthumously published, as the Grundrisse or the
Mm,
theories of surplus value, right? That there are some passages in those that seem to point in the other direction, although I think some of those are a little bit more ambiguous. But by the time he writes Capital, which of course is I mean that's really his masterpiece, right? I mean that's
right.
the one that Capital Volume One is the only one of these things that he actually prepares for publication, and
Mm-hmm.
finalizes. And it seems to me that Marx pretty clearly does think in Capital that commodities have values in these earlier modes of production where you still have some commodity production and exchange going on. So I can just give you a couple of examples of places where uh, it seems to me that he pretty clearly says that. So the first is most editions of Capital. One of the first things you come to when you flip it open, or at least after you get past the big I don't know, introduction by Ernest Mandel in the Penguin edition or whatever, and you actually get to the beginning of the stuff that's written by Marx. Um, then one of the first things you get to, right, it's the preface to the first German edition, and in there he says that people have been trying to and failing, right, to solve the mystery of value for 2,000 years. And even though he says that the answer is very slight in content, and he gives this reason for thinking that people would be confused about, that like people wouldn't figure this out, and it seems to me that it's a purely epistemic reason that he gives, right? So in other words, it's not an ontological reason. Value just doesn't exist for most of that 2,000 years. It's an epistemic reason. He says, well, it's the same reason people, have succeeded in analyzing more complex economic forms, but not value, for the same reason that it's harder to investigate biological cells than it is organisms that are made from them, which is also, it seems to be a pretty suggestive analogy because, people in ancient Athens, for example, didn't know about cells either, but it's not like cells didn't exist. And then I think the even clearer case um, is that when he starts talking about Aristotle in chapter one, and he says he actually credits Aristotle for having, gotten most of the way to the argument that he himself gives in chapter one about value and exchange value, which is basically, okay, you have these exchange value ratios and markets that, such and such many yards of linen, are worth one coat and all that stuff. And but in order for this many yards of linen to be worth the same thing as one coat, and for that matter, you could have all sorts of totally heterogeneous examples that such and such many pounds of coffee, gasoline, whatever, right? That the actual use value of the commodities are totally different from each other, right? Their physical stuff is totally different from each other. Yet we say that such and such amount of one commodity is worth the same as such and such amount of another. And so he says that there must be there must be some kind of common monadic property that they both have in common that ground this relation. In other words, some common property that's not relational, that's like the commodity itself has. And I'm sure a lot of people watching this have read this or familiar with the argument, but Marx makes this argument and then he says, okay, Aristotle comes very close to making it, and he quotes this bit from the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle does like the first step and a half, right, of that argument, right, and it's talking about, was it beds and houses, and it's actually a really weird example in the Aristotle. It's like, 3 beds are worth the cost of one house or something like that.
Yeah.
It's like I don't I can't quite wrap my mind around whether beds were really expensive in ancient Greece or
Yeah.
houses were really cheap,
Yeah. Is
But
he is he joking, or were beds really nice, or were houses really cheap? But
yeah, right.
and then Marx says, like, yeah, he couldn't take the rest of the steps because he presupposes slave labor and or something like that, right?
Yeah, no, exactly, right. So he says that Aristotle couldn't take the remaining, didn't take the remaining steps in the argument. And it's worth saying parenthetically, Marx loves Aristotle, right? He's pretty much the only, previous thinker who gets a positive write-up in Capital Chapter 1, that like otherwise it's just a massacre, right? This hating on everybody, but like but the references to Aristotle are almost invariably positive. And and he says, and he says, despite Aristotle's genius, he couldn't, and then he uses some phrase like penetrate the mystery or solve the puzzle or something like that, right? Which again suggests that there is in fact a mystery to be solved, right? That there is this fact that Aristotle was unable to discover. Um,
Killer point. Killer point. Yeah.
and so and in fact his explanation of why Aristotle was unable to discover this fact once again seems like a purely epistemic explanation, that it's just purely about about sort of ideas and knowledge, right, rather than about what is there to be discovered. That a lot of people, I think, who want to read this the other way sort of convince themselves that it must be that Marx thought that there was no fact there for Aristotle to discover, but but he, I just don't see how to square that with the language itself. I went and looked at Michael Heinrich's book, the How to Read Marx's Capital, to see what he says about this, and it just kind of seemed to me that Heinrich doesn't, even though he clearly has the view I'm criticizing Roberts, he doesn't seem to see that there's anything in this passage that undermines that view. But in fact, Marx's explanation of why Aristotle makes this mistake is that he says, that because he lived in a society based on slave labor, that he had this ideological blinder, that he couldn't sort of see universal human labor as being a thing, that in other words that there was this sort of common capacity that was being was being exercised by everybody as they were doing any sort of labor, because the society was based on the inequality of labor. And I think everything I just summarized, at least the last few sentences, what I just summarized, I think you could read either way. But then the way he sort of sums all this up at the end of the paragraph is he says, okay, people couldn't make this, conceptual breakthrough based on equal human labor until equality had become a fixed popular opinion. But it's like, wait a second, why are we talking about fixed popular opinions if this is ontological, if this is about what actually exists, rather than being this epistemic distinction about what we can know exists? And then to me, like in some ways, I mean, even though I think in some ways the Aristotle passage is kind of the clearest in terms of the language on this direct point, in some ways, the thing that seems most clear to me is just that this whole discussion of value takes place in chapter one. And so, presumably, whatever Marx has to say about how value works is going to be applicable under the assumptions that we're operating in chapter one. But chapter one explicitly, you know, takes place in a not quite capitalist hypothetical society that if you look at chapter one footnote 15, right, he says, at this stage of our presentation, wage labor does not even exist, right? In other words, and this is not some eccentric reading that I'm doing. I mean, this part is pretty standard, right? That it seems like the first few chapters of Capital take place in this hypothetical construction of a society of simple commodity production, because Marx, I think the way that Marx builds up his conceptual tools over the course of Capital, he he'll often like bracket one issue while so he can kind of train his analytical microscope on another one, right? So he'll say, for example, right, like in the later chapters when he's talking about the working day and all that stuff, he says, all right, I'm just assuming that every commodity is selling at its value, including wage labor, which would mean in context of Marx's theory that um, labor power, uh, if labor power is being sold at its value, that would mean that that workers are never being paid at a level that would take them below the historically established level of subsistence that they had at that time. But look, it's not like Marx doesn't know that oftentimes employers will try to push wages down below that level. Of course he knows that, right? But he's just making that as a simplifying assumption to, so he can say, okay, even if we hold that in place, it's almost like a word problem in a math or physics class, right? And similarly, in the first few chapters, since he wants to, obviously the project in the whole book is to look at the dynamics of capitalism,
Right.
but in the first few chapters, he wants to completely take the issue of capitalist class structures off the table, because he just kind of wants to think about how commodity exchange works per se, even without that, in the first few chapters. Hence, at this stage of our presentation, wage labor does not exist. It's this sort of hypothetical construction of simple commodity production, that we're assuming a society where everybody is producing their own goods and everybody is bringing their own goods to market and selling them, um, rather than some people being workers and some people being capitalists. And so, and I'd say, I know it's been a really long answer, but I just wanted to bring in one other thing, right? Which
No,
is,
this is not too long for us. This is a really good answer. Thank you. We appreciate it.
okay, good. So, which is that, if you go, I mean, so certainly, just in terms of why, those first three chapters, right, take place, in a society that's not quite capitalist. I think that the fact that he's saying, okay, we're assuming, I mean, again, this is not some stage of history, because when would that have been, right? It's just, but it's just this hypothetical construction. It says, all right, we're just interested in thinking about how commodities work. So we're just going to bracket off all the capitalist class structures and pretend those don't exist right now.
Right, like the banking
So
system and it's just not the global markets. It's none of this stuff's on the table right now. He's bracketed, and it's sort of like he's just dealing with these ideal averaged forms in a
yeah,
sort of
exactly,
rudimentary
because
logical way.
totally right, because and in some ways is very deliberately doing what bourgeois economists will often do, right?
Hmm.
Because that if I mean, it's like clearly, right, the most amazing thing, right? You read most economics textbooks now, or for that matter, you read the people that Marx is grappling with, your Adam Smiths and all those guys, right? And they just kind of talk about economics as if everybody is producing and selling their own goods, right, rather than some people being workers and some people being capitalists and all that stuff. And I think Marx is very deliberately aping that at the beginning of Capital, because a lot of his larger project is to show that it's not the case that the sort of pathologies of capitalism come from markets like not working the way they're supposed to, or something like that, right? That they're, it's not that the rules of market fairness are being violated and workers are being cheated in exchanges or anything like that, right? It's that actually the dynamics of markets themselves are the source of the problem, or at least half the source of the problem, the other one being the property relations that give you this class of propertyless laborers who are willing to sell themselves to capitalists. Uh, but okay, so this is, and if you're talking about simple commodity production, that's, I think, pretty clearly not capitalism for a couple of reasons. One of them is that that presumably most of the time in simple commodity production, what you're doing is going to be CMC, right? You're selling commodities in order to get money, in order to get other commodities, to round out the use values that you need, rather than MCM, right? Turning money into commodities to turn into more money for its own sake, to accumulate more exchange value. And then, but the second is, even if you are doing that in simple commodity production, even if you are doing MCM prime, right, to accumulate more money for its own sake, uh, it's still pretty clearly not capitalism, because if you read ahead to chapters 11 and then 13, Marx makes a big point of saying that the proprietor of a firm only becomes a capitalist once they're employing enough wage laborers that they can actually just live off of the labor of others, right? That he says that you're still, so he introduced this terminology in chapter 11 that's like, okay, that the small master only transforms into a capitalist once they employ enough labor powers that the formerly small master becomes, that can occupy themselves just with the business side of things, and maybe managing the workers, but they don't have to do productive labor themselves. Before that, they're this hybrid thing. And it says explicitly in chapter 13 that the capitalist mode of production only really gets going when you overcome these old guild rules that limited how many people could be working under one master, and so again, small masters could become capitalists. That's this sort of starting point of the capitalist mode of production. So it seems to me that, and also I'd point out that there are lots of places where Marx uses wage labor and capitalism as synonyms or near synonyms, right? Like so there's one of those in Capital. There's the other. I don't remember what footnote it is,
When he
but the other
uses
footnote.
wage, labor, and capital as synonyms?
No, and capitalism.
Oh,
Capitalism.
capitalism. Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. Clearly not wage labor and capital, but yeah, wage labor and capitalism, right? Like he'll say things like the system of wage labor, right? Like
Right.
when he means capitalism, right? So the other place he talks about Aristotle in chapter 1, there's another footnote again, I don't remember which one it is, where he says that he talks about uh, he's talking about Bastiat, the French politician and economist, and 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 he and at the end of his discussion of him, he says, if a genius like Aristotle could be wrong about slave labor, why couldn't a dwarf like Bastiat be wrong about wage labor, right? That's like a place where he's sort of using wage labor as a way of talking about like what the mode of production is. Or like a couple years before, in his inaugural address to the First International, he's there's this paragraph where he's talking about how just like slave labor and serf labor, he doesn't actually say dustbin of history. I think that's like Lenin or Trotsky or somebody, but he's expressing the same thought, right? Just as these, were transient forms. He says that went off the stage of history, so will wage labor, right? So he's using that phrase to talk about the mode of production, and he's saying that doesn't, but in this hypothetical construction of simple commodity production, there is no wage labor, and there's certainly no capitalists, because there aren't even small masters, never mind capitalists, because if everybody's producing and, selling their own goods, all of which is just to say, I have a really hard time seeing uh how um yeah, I have a really hard time seeing how you could think that commodities having value is unique to capitalism, at the same time as his whole theory of the value of commodities is put forward during a section of the book where we're talking about this hypothetical society that actually isn't quite capitalist.
Yo, what's up, listener or viewer?
Yo, yo, yo.
How you doing?
So I noticed you sitting there watching this video.
Yep.
And yeah, you're listening, you're paying attention. You're definitely not hearing everything we're saying though.
Yep. Nope, definitely not. You're not taking notes.
Yeah, take notes, dude. What are you doing?
Hey, you know what? If you want to be passive and just enjoy this content while multitasking, that's what we do as well. Everyone does that most of the time. We very rarely switch into this more active mode, and that's fine. That's fine because you're kind of absorbing this content as you go through your life, and that's great. But if you're going to do that, then we just have a little request of you. What's our little request, Nance?
We want you to do the algorithm things. We want you to hit the button, the thumbs up, or the thumbs down. Hit the subscribe button. You could even hit the bell so you get notified when there's an epic marathon stream.
Yep.
Or one of the dope ass interviews. We just finished a dope ass interview. But do the things to help train your algorithm to actually give you content that you prefer. And at least here we are aware of the problem. We are aware that we're all infected with the algorithm, and we're trying to do something about it. So while you can maintain a cynical distance of not being an enthusiastic vocal supporter,
right?
Doing those actions actually, first of all, it helps the channel. It helps Theory Underground. But it helps your algorithm too. You will get less kind of shitty clickbait React content if you train your algorithm to give you what you prefer. I mean, you're already here. You're already watching this.
Yeah. So enthusiastic, unironic, genuine support might be a little too much for some of you who are way too cool for that kind of thing. But you can at least hit the little like button, and then we'll say we're even, okay?
There we go. You owe us nothing now.
Yeah, let's get back to it. Amazing. And it looks like the kitty has officially left the camera. We did give him, I had actually set up a kitty cam. I didn't want to interrupt you, but just so you know, there was a kitty cam. But we're going to go ahead and leave him to his beauty sleep for now. And the kitty cam wouldn't have happened if you hadn't pointed it out. So thank you for that. Now, okay. You covered a lot of ground. I don't know if I'll be able to track all of it, but I want to ask a couple of questions. Now, Michael Heinrich, now him and his argument with Mosley is something that Nance and Nance is currently double speeding everything you said to catch up with the conversation, and maybe he'll join us once he's caught up. But so we're interested in this value form Marxism versus labor theory of value approach. That sounds related but different. Am I correct?
Yeah, I think it's related in the sense that, my sense of this, and there might be some of this literature that that you could tell me, right? But my sense of this is that people in this value form camp tend to be pretty invested in the idea that value is unique to the capitalist mode of production, but it's different in the sense that there might be people, in fact, I think there are people who disagree with them about that, who disagree with those people's more general views, who might still disagree with me about this.
Right.
And and I think it's at least an interesting question whether those people have to disagree with this, to
Right.
like consistently with what they're saying. I guess I'm not sure, right? It would, because I think you could maybe, right? And a lot of this just depends on the details of the views that, I'm certainly not, I'm certainly not an expert about what all these people think, right? But but I think that there might be a way of squaring the two if you say, right, like, I mean, part of the issue is how, so like, all right, so if you think that commodity production and value are necessarily coextensive for Marx, uh, you you still have a couple of options, I think, because you have you so I'm just thinking as I'm talking here, but I mean, like, I
Right.
think you might be able to say, like, because like one view that you could have, right, is that yeah, value is like the core of the whole thing. And sure, um, you do have commodities having value in Carolingian Europe or ancient Athens, whatever. But the sort of unique thing about capitalism is just that it's generalized, right? Like
It's the
that
central rule of exchange over use in the value form, and the law of value being that the prices of commodities are going to average to the production, the socially necessary labor time of their production, and that's a generalized thing that comes with industrialization, right? So that's. But are there stakes to
uh,
this that you see like immediately, or like to
sure.
me? Getting to the bottom of
Yeah,
the value form versus labor theory of value, or transhistoricity of value versus not, like, to me, I'm always like, okay, so what are the stakes,
yeah,
especially for the
yeah. No, that's fair.
especially for the listeners who are maybe like on the outside of the whole debate, like, what are the stakes for people?
Sure. Yeah. Uh, right. So, okay. And this is something that I'm not terribly invested in a particular view of, you know, how much this matters. I think that this is, I think that, I mean, I think some of the stake is just like, hey, if you're interested in devoting a lot of time to reading this, right, that it's, then you should get really clear on, what the view is, right? So I'm perfectly happy to think about this in the same way as, as you might think about, like, I don't know, you know, you're just trying to figure out what, transcendental deduction, like what the steps are, and you're not, and it's not probably going to be uh terribly politically urgent, but it sure is interesting, right?
Mm.
So if that turns out to be the case, fair enough, right? Like, I still think, again, those of us who do spend a lot of time, on this book, right? It's still worth getting clear on, but I think there might be some interesting political stakes here, and or at the very least, there might be it might be relevant to how we think about Marx's views about capitalism, exploitation, etc. So, it because I think that, if we're kind of at a medium place between, okay, here's why it's going to be politically urgent versus, oh, it's just like thinking about Kant, right? Like, if
Right.
we're going to be somewhere in between those two poles, I think, okay, well, how could this at least matter for uh, understanding what Marx's views about capitalism are, right? And I think that uh, and so, I think that some of the issue here is going to be, right, like, again, my understanding of some of the value form stuff, and um, you know, I don't know. I think that some of these authors are, you know, clarity could be improved, right? But
Right. Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah, 100%.
but my but like my understanding of what some of them seem to be saying is that the kind of essential thing going on with capitalist exploitation is about value production, that's the that this is maybe in a certain sense even what capitalist exploitation just is, right? To the point where I'll see people saying things like, even if we had, I don't know, like we have a global socialist revolution tomorrow, and we're figuring out how to reorganize the economy, and we have, and so, I don't know, we nationalize all the banks, and we have, workers control, on the shop floor, and we come up with some, we come up with some way to do all of this, but we still haven't figured out how to completely get rid of markets and money, because that's like just logistically really really hard, right? I mean, see the history of Soviet planning, and they didn't even try to go that far, right? Then I'd see people who seem to be very influenced by this kind of school of thought saying, "Oh, yeah, sorry, still capitalism," right? That this is, that you're still describing something that, hasn't, since we haven't transcended the value form yet, it's still, it
Right.
still counts, right? And um and so I think that
That would
whether or
be,
not,
I think that is what Pistone is ultimately doing in Time, Labor,
yeah,
and Social
yeah,
Domination, right? Yeah. He's saying you
yeah,
guys are talking about a different form of management and representation when it comes to the workers versus the capitalists. Abolishing the capitalists and having the workers represented does not change the actual mode of production at the form of its production, which currently is shaped, the literal division of labor, it's shaped around the production of value. It is defined by the law of value, and the contradictions produced by the law of value can be mediated by some kind of a central organ that is representing the workers and has dispossessed or replaced the capitalists. But you have not changed the mode of production in a way that actually gets at what Marx is trying to get at in his focus on labor, which is why he goes after this whole, we can't transhistoricize labor. Whenever Marx is saying labor, in almost every meaningful sense, in almost every meaningful case, he's talking about wage labor specifically. And we're not talking, now you've abolished wage labor because people are just represented by the Soviet state and, they have votes instead of paychecks. No, that doesn't do it. That's still not, they have rations. No, that's not going to do it, he's saying. And so that would
right.
be the stakes for Pistone. I'm not sure what the stakes would be for Caratani, and I'm not sure what the stakes would be for Heinrich, though I do think I can say what people say the stakes are for Heinrich, but I'm not sure if Heinrich
Sure.
would agree with those people. But that's kind of where we're at right now, I think.
Well, yeah, I am. So I think that's actually really interesting that you went into Pistone there, because I think uh, you know, a lot of my contact with these views over the years has been secondhand, through Doug Lane, who I think, I think Pistone was big for him. So
Okay, yeah.
so that makes a lot of sense to me, that Pistone would be the one in that crowd most clearly saying it. So what is your sense of, I mean, I know you said you weren't sure that it was accurate to what he thinks, but what's your sense of what people would think Heinrich would think?
And this might be the same thing that people would say
Sure.
about Pistone, being just,
Uh,
he's a social democrat, he's not a revolutionary.
uh,
And that they're saying that the old sort of Leninist approach, this revolutionary Marxist approach, assumes the most important thing is at the level of the means of production being seized by the dictatorship of the proletariat. When Pistone comes along and does all of this, Catron, who was a student of Pistone, he'll always say,
mhm.
no, just because you're pointing out a problem with traditional Marxism doesn't mean that you have a real solution. Your real solution is what? liberalism. And then that's what people seem to be saying. So people like Mosley, I get the sense, and I think when we had Sahil on, he was also saying this, that the way it cashes out for Heinrich is basically saying something like a focus on finance and taxation and something to do with a focus on exchange, like that's going to be the solution because it's not going to come from the seizure of the means of production, and that theoretically this is the value form approach is necessary for that. I'm not sure why.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, no, that wouldn't be obvious to me either. Yeah, right. And so I guess my own position on this would be the sort of most boring possible view, which is that I pretty much think that traditional Marxism is right. In other words, that if we're thinking about how to delineate different modes of production, then what actually matters most is the relationship between the immediate producers and who's ever, in control, of the social surplus in a given society, right? Do you have workers and capitalists? Do you have lords and serfs? Do you have, slave owners and, slaves? Do you have that is a society of associated laborers? And certainly Marx himself assumes that once you get to the society of associated laborers, then you'll just abolish, markets and money, and you'll have, I mean, he famously doesn't talk very much about the logistics, right? But you'll have presumably some form of democratic planning. The closest he gets is in the Critique of the Gotha program, where, because of the context of like the views that he was responding to, his focus is on how distribution will work in the system, which is a little bit of a different question from like how you even sort of figure out production priorities in the first place and all that. But he, but like certainly in that description, or like, I don't know, there's a footnote in like somewhere, I want to say maybe the second chapter of Capital, where because he's talking about like labor money schemes and why he doesn't like them, and he says, well, look, it could be that in a totally marketless society that you could have something that would sort of look like labor money, that you'd have your this like chit for like the hours worked that that you could exchange for something that's took that many hours to produce. But he says this would no more be money than the ticket you get when you check your coat at the theater, is money that you're using to buy the coat, right? So that is, again, as sort of fragmentary as this stuff is, it is pretty clear that Marx's hope about how a society of associated producers plays out is that you do have this totally marketless setup. And I think that even given a sort of very boringly traditional Marxist reading of what Marx is up to, there are good reasons, I think, that he would have had that hope, right? That that there because even if you have even while disagreeing with Pistone, that the sort of like setup I floated earlier would like still be capitalism, right? Which again, um even in terms of what Marx thinks, I just cannot I just can't understand how Pistone reconciles that with what Marx says in chapters 11 and 13 about how how capitalism, like, how you're not even a capitalist yet, you're still a small master if you don't employ enough labor powers, and how capitalism only gets started as a mode of production once capitalists start to employ enough labor powers. But even if you don't think that would be capitalism, right? If you have like an economy where, say, the commanding heights, right, are nationalized, we have nationalized banks, all that stuff. and you have maybe like if you read like David Schweikart's book After Capitalism, the sort of setup he describes there, or if you read like Bhaskar Sinkar's book The Socialist Manifesto, the first chapter is A Day in the Life of a Socialist Citizen, the sort of setup he describes there, where essentially maybe the physical means of production are owned by socialist state and sort of rented out to collectives of workers, that even if you think this wouldn't still count as being still capitalism, even if you think this would count as a new mode of production, you might still think that it's like less desirable than making it all the way to a totally marketless form of socialism for all sorts of reasons. I mean, just real quickly, like two that come to mind are one, that the actual degree of democracy is lesser, because if you have if you sort of achieve the Richard Wolff democracy at work stuff, that's great. But of course, workers at a given workplace aren't the only people who are affected by what happens in that workplace. So the number of stakeholders who have a voice, right, isn't as good as it is if society as a whole could direct productive resources in a way that would seem to require totally marketless planning or something very close to it. And another reason is that even in terms of distributive like distributive equality, then which is obviously not what Marx himself is emphasizing, but like I think that nobody has ever become a socialist who wasn't concerned about it, right? I mean that you don't, it's like that you're not like part of the reason you object to the society you see around us is that it's crazily and unfairly unequal. That's just obviously going to be true. I mean, I think some people might feel theoretically compelled to deny it, but I mean that's obviously going to be part of your motivation. And even that, I think, is could be better, given totally marketless planning, because look, I mean, you have the inequality between workers and capitalists is definitely the most dramatic form of distributive inequality under capitalism. That's where you get like the ratio of like hundreds to one and all that stuff. But it's certainly not the only one. I mean, we've got even if you achieved, if you expropriated the capitalist class, had the kind of setup I'm talking about, then look, you still have, there's still some sectors of the economy that are going to generate more revenues than others. You still have, you like, if to the extent that you still have different firms, you still have some firms that are more successful than other firms, to even just to the extent that like individuals can have bargaining power in joining collectives, then some of that is going to trace back to advantages that individuals have that are outside of anybody's control. So I think for all of these reasons, yeah, look, if you can do totally marketless economic planning, we can, I don't know, have supercomputers give us red plenty or whatever, then that would clearly be better, right? But I think that Marx doesn't wrestle with the logistical difficulties in figuring out how to do that, partially just because that's not his focus, right? I mean, you're not, I think you're allowed to only make earth-shattering contributions to like a few things in one lifetime. But then the other one is just that a lot of these debates about how socialist planning could work and all that stuff just don't come about right until the early 20th century. And so we can speculate about what Marx would have said about those debates, right? But I mean, he just wasn't weighing in on them. Certainly the experience of the Soviet Union, doesn't happen, until several decades, after he's died, right? So I think that I think even if you go with that kind of traditional Marxist view that no, really the ownership of the means of production really is the sort of heart of the issue about capitalist exploitation, you might still think separately from that it's like, yeah, there are perfectly good reasons why, Marx assumed that having taken over the means of production, workers would want to do totally marketless planning. And, that's a goal that makes sense, right? Even if it's like it's incredibly hard once you really start thinking about it to like figure out the logistics of how it can work.
But it also doesn't, and I know we have to close out in a couple seconds
sure.
here, so maybe you could like incorporate your response to this and some closing remarks that maybe set us up for a future conversation. But basically, that doesn't have to come from workers organizing, does it? The means of production, the mode of production, and the relations of production doesn't have to come from a primarily or predominantly working class self-organized movement, and it right?
I think it would, right? Because I think you could have I think that if you're going to because I think again, I'm not breaking any ground here. I think this is all pretty boringly standard, right? But I think that there are two issues here, right? So one, could the goal of collective ownership and workers' control of the means of production come about from anything other than the activity of the workers themselves? And certainly the answer historically has been no, right? That that there's even where you get expropriation of capitalists without it coming from the self-activity of workers, like in Russia's a more complicated case because there was a bigger element of self-activity of workers at the beginning phases, but if you think about Eastern Europe after World War II or China or etc., the result hasn't been anything like workers control the means of production. But the other thing is just look, I think that the core of the in a developed capitalist country, especially, even that, right, it's really hard to see how it could happen, right? It seems like the kind of traditional Marxist view on this is that the workers themselves are the only force in society that has both the capacity and the collective interest to bring about this kind of transformation.
Okay, I think that's a great sort of place to cut ourselves off. I really look forward to hearing more. And Nance is currently able to have you kind of unpack some of this a little bit more and bring up some of the questions from the chat in the green room if you've got the time. But everybody, for right now, we'll be right back after this.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place for workers with earbuds who are tired of letting others read and think on their behalf, slipstreaming our way into an understanding of the situation that short-circuits the deadlocks of our moment.
Research at Theory Underground focuses on what is most important for understanding our current situation: theory of the subject, capital, time-energy theory, critical media theory, CMT, and the most essential critiques necessary for understanding why the theory, ideology, and common sense of influencers left to right misses the mark.
Theory Underground is coming to a city near you. What that has meant in the last year is traveling across the United States, into Canada, and then all over Europe to promote our books, courses, and ideas related to time energy and underground theory. You've been reading Underground Theory.
I'm a publisher and an editor. I run a review of books. Literally, it's my living. This is the best edited collection I've ever read.
Okay, picture this scene. America, early 2021. An Amazon warehouse worker arises from the emerging underground theory internet scene to create spaces for untimely topics and concerns that are too often neglected or kept in isolation today. Joined by a revolving cast of underground theorists, academics, and critics, he establishes what will become Theory Underground, a teaching, research, and publishing platform by and for working class intellectuals, autodidacts, and academics who want to do more than they're able to do within the confines of academia. That warehouse worker's name is David McKerracher, and his book Timenergy is his first major contribution to the world of theory. It was recently reprinted with a foreword by none other than Slavoj Žižek, who also contributed to Theory Underground's latest book.
My Bible, it's an excellent book.
A collection of essays called Underground Theory.
What you just heard is an excerpt from the Strange Exiles podcast, episode 23, where Bram from Strange Exiles interviewed me and Mikey. For those who don't know, Mikey is the author of the Dangerous Maybe blog. We are publishing one of his books here shortly at Theory Underground. He's also a lecturer at Theory Underground, and he's someone I've been friends and a collaborator with for over 10 years. But most importantly for you all, he's a fantastic lecturer, and it's a crime that he has to do wage labor right now. One of the long-term goals of Theory Underground has been now for a couple of years to hashtag free Mikey. That is something that I've been really pushing, but first I had to get freed from wage labor, which was achieved this year. That's right. Thanks to my monthly seminar subscribers, I was able to quit Amazon and do Theory Underground full time. Now I'm announcing the next big phase of the plan, which is the Mikey Down seminar. What monthly subscribers to the Mikey seminar are paying for is a survey of philosophy, including deep dives into Žižek, Land, Lacan, Baudrillard, Bataille, Lyotard, and ultimately the whole history of philosophy.
We're trying to build like this ongoing seminar, right? And that's what I really like about this thing, where, you know, if I'm teaching a main text, that's something I got to focus on. I got to really, but the seminar thing, we can do this stuff all the time where we dive deeper into concepts, we dive deeper into certain, you know, sections of books or whatever, and we can really do this nuanced stuff.
I think that there's probably no better way for us to accelerate our learning in these areas than by slipstreaming Mikey. And that has been my belief for years and years and years now. It's official. You're able to help out. You're able to get involved. You're able to benefit directly from liberating him from wage labor. Get on it right now. Do it. Just go. Stop what you're doing. Go click the button. Subscribe. This is what you do. Subscribe to him. If you're already signed up for the ongoing Theory Underground seminars, then that's the ones that I do with my wife, Anne. Though that's getting an upgrade, which means that I will be doing one session per month that is just me, and then I will also be doing the ones with Anne, which are a crash course in sociology, anthropology, the social sciences, and ultimately Marx, Heidegger, Levinas, Bourdieu, imminently critiquing pop psychology, sociology, self-help, and ultimately the doxa of our time. But if you would like to be a subscriber to both Mikey's seminar and the seminar that the Snellgrove McKerrachers are doing, then the best way is to become a Tier 4 subscriber, or you can be a Tier 2 subscriber to each of us. The reason this matters is because Tier 2 is like pretty much the best bang for your buck. It gives you huge discounts on all of the courses that we do. But if you can't afford it, Tier 4 is amazing because it gives you Tier 3 access at both Mikey's seminar and ours.
And finally, not everybody has time to be part of these ongoing research seminars, and they just want to fund the paid content for the YouTube and podcast. And so thank you so much to our patrons over at Patreon. They're the ones funding all the free stuff. So big thank you to Bert, Marilyn, Carl, Sahil, Zozandra, Nikolai, Darian, Tyler, and Mandeep, and all the other wonderful patron people. Patreon people. And thank you to all the other wonderful Patreon people. Thank you so much to all of you patrons, and also to the special subscribers and the paying subscribers. Oh my god, it's just so awkward. Thank you, Patreon. Patrons. Thank you. Oh, okay. And to all the other wonderful patrons. Thank you so much, all you patrons. And also a special thanks to the subscribers on the YouTube side, as well as the paying subscribers over at Substack. Why can't we do this? Fuck. You guys, please. Just thank you. Thank you, everyone, for making this bullshit possible. Thank you to the subscribers.
You do it. You did so good. Thanks, guys.